we're going to be talking a little bit about me first. So I've been with Exabeam for about a year. I spend most of my time interacting with customers on site, one-on-one, or with their teams, working through the different processes they have, the different architectures they have. And so I've seen a lot in the last 6 months. It's kind of like, think of it as a real short security consulting engagement. That's what I spend most of my time working with customers. I do some with people that aren't customers or prospects as well. But on the right, you see a little bit, I think that's your right. Yep, you're right. Some things I've done recently. There's one of my puppies. Been running the excavator at a family property. There's a margarita machine, that's from Texas. So every now and then you have a little Mexican food and some margaritas. And then over on the bottom right, one of my sisters lives in Chico, and got to spend some time. There's a big park there in Chico. Anybody know that one? Anyway, since I'm in California, I thought you might know that. It's a really neat park, and they took me on a little tour. My IT background, I've spent about 10 years in related to security field in some form or fashion, a little more focused in the last 5 years. But in my role, I've seen thousands of architectures. One of the things I love about my job is I don't do the same thing every day. I've seen lots of different environments, lots of different situations and processes and workflows, and you see so many of them, they start to have patterns, and so we're going to go through some of that today. That's one of the fun things about my job. So let's get going. We're focused on workflow today, and to me, workflow is a combination. I call it a mashup of what logs do you have coming in, what tools do you have running against those logs, what is your ingestion, what are the people that are doing, what are the tools you have. If I mix it all together and kind of like, anybody you throw the chips up in the air and see where they land? So as I walk through today, we're going to talk about some of the different choices people make. Sometimes there's not necessarily a right choice. There's multiple choices. So we're going to talk about why you would make one choice one way versus the other. And I'm going to show as I go through them, there's a little bit of an evolutionary approach. So you go from simple to more complex, or starter to final picture, or another way to think about it is maturity, low maturity to high maturity, depending on how you want to think about it. But you'll see that as I go through. So there is kind of an intent of that. So just a little bit, I may use some acronyms. Just kind of a nice thing to do for everybody is just go through some acronyms I might use. I'll try to use the words, but SIEM, Security Incident and Event Management System, or Log Management System. SIEM is Case Management or Case Manager. SOAR is Security Orchestration and Automated Response. AA is Advanced Analytics. DL is Data Lake. Incident Response, or IR is Incident Response, both the name of our product and a function. SOC, Security Operations Center, and I noticed I have IR on there twice. That's funny. So what about activity logs? I think a lot of security teams focus on their security tools and their security architecture and what they do with those logs that come from this. Like, hey, I want my EDR logs, or hey, I want my DLP logs, or hey, I want my email proxy logs, or web proxy logs. Great. What about activity logs? So this is a UEBA product. What are we trying to monitor? User and entity behavior. What is the primary indicator of user and entity behavior? It's not the security logs. It's activity logs. So as we talk through that, as we talk through different workflows here, what drives your users? One of the best questions to ask and ways to deal with that is what drives your user's behavior? And then how do you detect that user behavior? Right? Here's a couple of examples, right? I go to a web domain. I go to Google. Is that malicious or not malicious? Is it normal or not normal? Is it harmful to the organization or not harmful to the organization? Just going to Google does not hurt the organization whatsoever. It's what I search for and what I click on afterward. Right? So I need more information around that user's activity to make a decision on whether that's risky or not risky. So activity logs, security logs are important too, but I think a lot of folks forget about this activity log concept. Another one is, I'll go through another one. We heard some examples earlier today and also from the airlines folks yesterday around application authentications. Hey, and somebody mentioned that, I think the Grant Thornton guys mentioned it this morning, if I can get some of that around your two-factor or your IAM solution. I see somebody log into an application, I get that from two-factor. I maybe don't have the application log specifically. It's Bob's homegrown application. I don't have the application logs, but I have set it up with SSO. I can start to connect events together and when users log into that application. So another big piece of this is context, right? How do you know what are your context sources? What can I get context from? I think one of our favorites typically is some type of HR information system. Hey, I want to know if somebody's on a performance plan, right? That's context. It gives me a bigger picture. If somebody has turned in their notice, they're at a greater risk for exfil. If somebody's on a performance plan, they're at a greater risk to the organization, not to themselves necessarily, but to the organization, around they might do something harmful to the organization like damage something, right? You see that especially in OT type environments. So context, if I'm looking at a person that is, say I'm looking at an HR database, I'm monitoring the HR database for access. Well, if it's an HR, somebody has a job function that is related to HR and they're looking at HR data, that's normal, right? I have context. What is, if they're not in HR, they're like in finance, they shouldn't be looking at HR data. If there's somebody in the IT department, maybe they should be looking at HR data because they're helping work on that system. They're helping repair that system. So context is huge. Activity logs are huge. You get activity context gives a bigger picture to the activity logs and to the security logs. So a couple these are warnings or speed bumps as you're building your different workflows. Do you have enough logs or too much? Right? We heard that a couple times from the Grant Thornton guys. This is one of the #1 things that I think people struggle with. The traditional SIEM approach is, let's take all our logs everywhere and dump them into the SIEM. And what happens 6 months later? The SIEM doesn't work. Or it doesn't return searches in a reasonable time frame, or whatever you're trying to do with it, because it has too much data in it, and I didn't plan for that appropriately. You can plan for it. It is possible to do that, but it may not be the best choice. And how are we answering these important questions? Like, the important question is an important question. What is the important team your team asks? Right? If a SOC team or an insider threat team or an incident responder is doing an investigation, what are the questions they have to answer every time? If they have to answer those questions every time, then you can automate that. So what are the important questions? Do you know what the important questions are? A lot of times I'll talk to an engineering team, and they've never sat down with their SOC team and actually watched them work an incident. Well, you should go do that. What about working for the other people in your organization? One of the things I regularly encourage folks to do is go interview the other organizations, and go sit down with them. Hey, I have somebody in HR. Let me sit down and talk to you for 30 minutes and tell me what you do every day. What systems do you look at? What does your normal behavior look like? And then I can go back and make sure that I have the right pieces of that puzzle in the Exabeam platform. And what's the risk associated with that? I think another trap that people fall into, a risk analysis. Do we have anybody here who does full-on numerical-based risk analysis against their whole organization? Curious if anybody's still doing that. Okay. So I've run into people that do that. I'm glad to see that there weren't anybody, or maybe 1 or 2 people raise their hands. I think of it as comparative, right, and relative risk to each other things. I think that's the other trap that people fall into. And I also usually, it's easier to start with a qualitative analysis like low, medium, and high risk, and then comparing 2 similar activities. So a good example is somebody badges in to a door that they've never badged into the first time. There's some risk associated with that. They did it for the first time, and they're not a new employee. That's context. I need to know they're not a new employee. But then they do it again. Well, they did it once, so maybe that's low risk. But if they did it a second time, that's maybe lower risk. Some organizations, that's higher risk. Right? That's part of answering the important question of the organization. And also, do you have the badge logs? Those are all different questions that I can ask. All right, let's get into the patterns here. So the first one is, we don't see this one very often, but it is a possible pattern. Hey, I have all my logs. I have no SIEM. I have no data layer. I have no log management. But I need to drive analytics or UBA into my environment. And the #1 time I see this one is I have a compliance requirement, or I have a breach of some sort that's driving a requirement across the organization for UBA before we get log management in place. It is possible to do this. Advanced analytics can take log feeds directly from most log sources, can take activity feeds from most log sources. So it is possible to do this. It's not a frequent pattern, but it is possible. Then usually what happens here in terms of that's the front side of that process. Then the second half of that process is AA will generate a notable. We'll fire an email, an incident notification is what we call them in the platform. It'll generate an email, and somebody then will respond out of an email inbox, right? So from a maturity process, the process is a straightforward process. From maturity for the organization, this is a low maturity organization, but this is one possible scenario. Let's build on that. So now we're going to add in our data lake, right? So we need a centralized collection of all the logs, like we just heard from the NTT folks, right? That's a centralized log collection has its own benefits instead of having some kind of decentralized thing. It also drives processes, right? I can have a single source to drive processes. You may have the same thing in terms of the detection and anomalies that are being collected or analyzed out of AA. Generate alerts, goes to email, and the SOC team responds. Simple response process, but you've added a little more complexity to your collection process and your pattern there. So let's make it a little more complicated. So now I'm starting to add case management. We're starting to do some automation here. So the automation, besides the built-in automation of the platform by itself, like the timelines and stuff like that, you have case management is now getting cases created directly from AA notables, for example. Now, it doesn't just have to be from notables. It can be from other data sources, like if you have a phishing inbox and you want to create cases that way. Easy way to do this one, to think about this one, is if you're driving your workflow, what's really, think about, the way I think of it is what's really starting your workflow for your operations teams, for your SOC operators. Is it a case? Is it an email? What starts their investigation or their review? You want to make sure that you map that. If you start to do this pattern, you want to make sure that you map all those starts, whether it's an email or they go into a console and look at a dashboard, or they go into a console and look at a bunch of alerts from a tool. You want to make sure all those are in the case management tool. Right? You're trying to, one of the biggest time reducers, I'm trying to think of a way to say that in a public place. The thing that takes a lot of time from people is context switching, right? If I have to go get an alert here and pull a report here and a dashboard here and a case here and I have another case system over here, that takes time. That takes time away from your SOC team from actually doing the investigation. I saw something on Twitter the other day, this week actually, around what's the best analysis engine? It's the wetware right here. Right? I want to make sure that that is engaged as much of the time as I can, not people doing context switching. So everything creates a case. The SOC team responds from the cases and interacts with the cases. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get here. So then we get a little more complicated. We start to add incident responder in there. Right? So what does incident responder do? It does two primary things in my mind. One of them is enrichment activities, and the other one is action activities. So what I mean by enrichment is, a great example is I get a DLP alert or an IDS alert, for example. Either one of those would work. And it has some IP address information in the alert. So I go enrich that. Hey, a simple example, I do a reverse DNS lookup. What's the host name that's associated with that IP address in my DNS servers? I can look at threat intel. Let me go query all my threat intelligence servers. Let me go, if it's a web proxy, most of your web filters will do this. Hey, let me go look at all the blacklists and spam lists that is associated with this IP address. That's an enrichment type activity. Let me do all the enriching I can do, give you all the information, look at that all up, and present it in the case. So when I go look at the case, all the enrichment or lookup activities that I would do as part of working that case is already done for me. That's sort of a second layer of automation that you can build on top of this stack. And then there's actions. I'll use an IP. That's an easy example. Hey, I want to go block that IP. So this looks really interesting when you start to have multiple firewall vendors. Hey, I go send an API call to all my firewalls across my organization, globally or continent-wise, and it inserts the block IP address, or it starts blocking that IP address. It's a change to the firewall. So you can do that in an automated way to get that information. And then if I'm not sure, you can separate if I'm not sure I like the automated actions, and this is where most people start, I want to separate the enrichment activities from the action activities. So enrichment case happens, enrichment happens, and then it gets presented to an analyst. The analyst reviews the case information and the enrichment information, and then they hit the action button, hey, go take the action. So there's a stop there to maybe a validation, or you're just not 100% sure that you want something 100% automated, then you can do it that way. All right, those are relatively straightforward. So now we're going to get a little bit more complicated ones. Those are using all 3 of those. 4 of those, we're using our stack, the Exabeam stack. So now we're going to start talking about how we integrate our stack with other stacks. If you were, we would call this an augmentation exercise instead of a full SIEM deployment. We heard Nir talk about a little of that yesterday. So in this, you have your logs going to an existing SIEM. It could be QRadar, Splunk, Data Lake, Nitro, doesn't really matter. And it could be multiple SIEMs, right? Like we saw in the NTT example, they had multiple SIEMs. There's a number of organizations that have multiple SIEMs, or there's multiple business units that have multiple SIEMs. All the SIEM data is being forwarded to a single instance of advanced analytics, right? That's starting to take some of that context switching out of what's going on. So AA will then generate the notables, and then those get forwarded back into the SIEM, right? So there's 2 reasons you might do this. A lot of times when you have this particular pattern, most of the time I see if you've made an investment in SIEM, you don't want to get in the SIEM like layers here, the traditional SIEMs, you don't want to get out of it. You're locked into it for budget reasons. You have a lot of work on top of it. You've already done enrichment and reporting or dashboards, the compliance team is using it, whatever. You've made an investment in that tool, and the switching costs are too high for whatever they are. I gave some examples. So there's already a workflow. Typically, there's already a workflow built on top of the existing SIEM platform. So I don't want to break that. And I mean, if we want to break it, we can. But it may be working for you. If it's working for you, then what you want to do is you want to take the alerts out of AA and feed them back into your SIEM to drive another data source for your existing workflows. So the SOC team here is really responding out of the SIEM after AA then creates that. But you may stop. So the pattern here is you may stop doing alerts in your SIEM based on alert-based alerting. That's kind of a silly way to say it. So a good example, I get an EDR alert. Right, a lot of organizations I run into have a mandatory investigation around a critical or high EDR alert. They have to investigate everyone, right? Okay, well, you're missing the automation we're doing in advanced analytics if that's your starting point. So let's turn that off. Let's make sure that that alert from your EDR flowing into AA, in this example here, creates a notable that would get triggered back into your SIEM. And then it would show you the automation of the timeline would be shown to you. So when the SOC team starts to do the investigation, they immediately jump into advanced analytics, not to the SIEM. The SIEM has the workflow, maybe a case or an email. Those are the 2 primary ones that start the work action. But you immediately pivot back into advanced analytics, and it shows you the context, the risk information. It shows you the activity before the whatever it is, CrowdStrike alert, or after the CrowdStrike alert, the EDR alert. So you get to see a bigger picture, right? I don't have to take the time to build that big picture to answer those hard questions because the data I need to answer those questions is already on the screen. I don't have to do any extra work. It's there. So this is a pretty common, I think a lot of deployments I've seen, they forget to forward the stuff out of AA back into their SIEM. If you have a working process with an existing SIEM, you want to forward it back in. Also, another fun thing to do here is to forward the anomaly data, right? In advanced analytics, there's 2 major data sets, right? There's the notable data set, which is a session based on the session scoring. And then there's the actual anomalies, right? The stuff in the right-hand column, the individual rules that fire. You can do some interesting reporting back on that in your SIEM if you want to, if you forward the anomalies back into your SIEM layer as well, or your data layer as well. One of the things if anybody's thinking about doing that and you're not doing it, I'll caution you to make sure you're sized appropriately. appropriately, those anomaly feeds can be quite, I would consider them a high volume feed, like a firewall traffic log feed. Just make sure you're thinking that through. So another model here is around, you have another separate case management tool outside of your SIEM. Some of this is the same. Right? This gets a little trickier here because if you have an external case management tool that's not in your SIEM, then I would forward the notables out of AA straight into your case management tool. Right? I don't need to run it through your SIEM back into the SIEM, which you might still do for auditing or reporting purposes. But from an operations perspective, you want to get that data back into your case management as quickly as possible. So the best plan here, I think, is to get it out of AA into your case management as quickly as possible, because you're using that to start your, again, what are you starting your investigations from? That's really the thing you should be thinking about. It is, like I said, it's okay to forward them to SIEM, but again, what's the trigger that creates a case? Forwarding out of your SIEM into your case management tool, traditional tool here. I don't think there's anything else. There's a level of automation here, right? There's two different types of, we don't stop, by the way, in this particular model, you don't stop the SIEM from forwarding its correlation alerts or whatever you have coming out of your SIEM into the case management system. It's just another data feed coming into your case management. So you have two data feeds, one from your SIEM, one from AA, feeding into your case management. Okay. Let's look at another one here. So we add into the platform. So what we've added here is we've added SOAR into this. Now, most of the SOAR platforms, ours included, have a case management tool built into them, because the case really should be your central repository where you start things, right? So this advanced analytics will create a case. Your SIEM can create a case. Whatever yours. And that will then forward into your SOAR playbook. And that we talked a little bit about that earlier. It would run those enricher actions. It would run the actions, the action functions, or the enricher functions, the two different functions. Let me think. This one gets interesting because, if you don't have the case, where do you want to put the information that SOAR does and run the enrichment actions? It really should be in the case. If you're doing this with email, you can do it in email, but again, you might get multiple emails. That gets annoying. It's trying to speed this up, right? Again, if we were to take the SOAR playbooks when they run and execute that as an email to somebody or something separate that wasn't the case, I'm creating multiple screens. I don't want to have to go watch alerts in a SOAR dashboard and watch alerts in my SIEM and watch cases. How can I bring that into a central starting point? It's more about the starting point than it is central starting point than it is about the different tools. You are still going to have to pivot to the different tools for different types of investigations, but think about it from different tiers. You may not. Some teams I talk to are smaller teams, right? Everybody does everything. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5, or whatever your tiers are. But you think about it, Tier 1 does monitoring and validation. Tier 2 may do a lightweight start the investigation. Tier 3 and 4 may go deeper into the investigation and start the response process. So what can I do to make the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 folks make it easier for them to do those investigations? What can I, easier, and to me, easier also equates to speed it up. How do I make it simpler or take less time? Those are all kind of part of easier in my book. Usually it's, hey, I get you in one screen. I start you with a case. If I have to pivot you, I pivot you once to another screen to do the investigation for that particular type of case. You look at all the information you need, whether it's from SOAR or from other tooling, and then you can continue your investigation to the point where you can make that decision. I think of it as a go, no-go decision. I either continue my investigation, escalate, or I close it or take an action. So let's go back. Can y'all go back to the slide that says context? So this context piece is important, right? I think this is one of the things that people struggle with, is what is context, and how do you bring context back into those different workflows, right? Think about how does an analyst know what somebody does? Right, what's their job? A job function is an easy example. You can get that from different places. Another good place, I didn't put it up there, is Active Directory. A lot of people will sync part of their HR system or some of the fields in their HR system into their Active Directory. Whether it's they use a tool for that or they wrote a script for it. That's another way to do that. I think I pointed that the wrong way. HR goes into Active Directory. So you can pull that directly out of HR. Like, these are the questions your analysts are asking. Like this, sit down with them and watch them do an investigation, and different tiers, different people. A lot of times, teams are broken up or focus on different tools. Like you might have a couple of analysts that are focused on the EDR alerts. You might have a couple of analysts focused on DLP alerts. You might have a separate DLP team. Like, go see what their investigations look like. Go map it out. Step by step by step. And the other piece I see people make mistakes, like the previous slide here was activity, right? What is the activity that they're trying to track back to? And how do I get that activity information? Somebody gave the example, I think it was the Grant Thornton guys this morning, around the different license levels with O365, right? If you get at a higher license level, you can get the full message trace logs, right? If you don't know that, and I want activity, if email is a concern, whether phishing or data exfil over email, those are two common use cases, right? I need the trace logs. I don't just need the security alerts out of O365, because I can then start to map and build models around what exactly those users are doing and those assets potentially. So how do you get started with this? How do you get started on building an architecture like this and mapping out the data flows? Again, I think it's a part of it is hey, I want to see the log flows. It's not just the log flows. I think that's one of the important things. But let's say, first thing you would do if you were going to try and work through some of this yourself is build a log source library. I want to know a list of everything that generates logs in your environment. I don't care what they are, what they do, if they're good or they're bad. Don't make any decisions. It's like a brainstorming activity. List all the logs. Make it a library, and then go in and prioritize those. I prioritize them in two different axes. One is around ease of attainment. What I mean by that is how easy is it to get those logs, right? Some logs are really hard to get. Some logs are really easy to get. Focus on the easy ones first, and then you make sure you have a project plan to work on the harder ones. So for example, a hard one is mainframe logs. Anybody have a mainframe? Getting those logs sometimes is really hard. You may have to have another tool that extracts those logs. Or you have, I ran into somebody the other day that they were using some application. I'm trying to remember what it was now. That the software vendor that owns that application or wrote that application, it does a great logging, meets every security requirement, compliance requirement, but the logs are an encrypted binary format, and there's no way to get them out. Oops. So that's going to be hard. You're going to have to. The vendor may have to rewrite their software to get logs out of that system, or you may have to put something in front of it that interacts with the transactions that system does. The other way is around the value of the asset, right? And this, I know a lot of people struggle with this. Asset management, CMDB is hard. I get it. This is one of those ones you kind of have to decide whether you're going to work on this or not. But if you know where your critical information is, critical applications, you probably know at least your top 10 critical things, whether it's a database or an application or users. What are your critical things, right? Assets is not just, remember we're focused on behaviors of users and assets. So it could be your most critical users, executives, privileged access, enterprise domain admins, SQL database administrators, right? These are users that are also critical. So you want to focus on how do I access, think of a DBA, right? What do? Maybe they log into Bastion, maybe they log into the database server, and they start interacting with their database. Do you have the access logs or the activity logs? But first you have the authentication logs to the administrator console for your database systems. Do you have any kind of Bastion or pre-access stuff they have to do? Do they have to two-factor into that? Then once you have the authentication logs into the database, a lot of those are tied into Active Directory, so Active Directory logs will help you there. Do you have the server logs, the security logs from the server there? And then do you have the actual logs from within the database system itself in your logging system? Those are actually usually pretty easy to get. The database guys may not want to give them to you, but they are quite easy to get and for most enterprise databases. I think I beat this one up already. Activity and security logs, right? The database one was all activity logs. I don't know if you caught that. A security log out of a database might be if you have some type of database firewall in front of your database, right? I want to see what queries are run by that database administrator. It might be collecting those. It might also be doing its own analytics on top of the access to that database. Hey, this database administrator tried to access a database they're not authorized to access. That would be considered a security alert. A lot of the DAMs will pick that up, the database firewalls. And then I started getting this a second ago, but process map. I've kind of walked some example patterns out. Put that pattern on a whiteboard somewhere and walk it through. Who does what with what, right? Where do your logs go? Where do they go next? Do I have, after you've worked your log library out, what does that show me? What can I derive from that? What kind of information, what kind of activity can I show? And then do this future, right? I talked through where do your SOC teams start? Usually you want to do it backwards and forwards, right? Start with logs, work your way all the way to an incident being created, then work it backwards, pick a bunch of incidents. Pick incidents. I usually ask two questions. Tell me your incidents that generate the most work for your SOC, and then it's usually in your top three: EDR, email, web, or DLP. Actually, that's top four. Then I ask them, okay, what of your incidents that were created for your SOC to investigate, how many of them did you actually respond to? Right? A lot of SOC teams are doing investigations, and they're doing no response. They investigate, close case. Right? So let's focus on the ones that are driving response, because the ones that are driving response, you must have thought something was interesting in there to drive the response. So let's see if we can detect that more or do a better job with detecting that. So that's the other way to do that. I do both of this. Start with an investigation that drove a response and make sure everything in that investigation is in your architecture from an activity and security alert tracking perspective. Whether it's in your SIEM or data lake or advanced analytics. It should be in advanced analytics, but it could be in either one of those. And then where do you want to go? Right? Do you want to add case management? Is it on your radar? Notice one of the things I put in there is that SOAR comes after case management. If you're looking at SOAR, and I know customers that are and prospects that are, you want to be doing case management before you do SOAR. Now, you may have an organizational reason not to do it that way. The one I hear the most, and this is kind of back to that pros and cons, every organization is a little bit different. Oh, we have 3 different case management systems, and you're telling me I should use a different one. Well, does one of those case management systems have your security data? Are you allowed to use it for security data? We are, but everybody has access to that system. Great, I don't want my insider threat investigations open to the entire IT operations team, right? So that may make a case or a business case to have a separate case management system. Or, a lot of the current platforms like ServiceNow, Sharewell, Remedy have the capacity or the capability to separate and different queues from different users, but the team that runs that doesn't know how to use that feature. Great, we need a separate case management system. So think about what you want to be and where you want to be and how you get there. Oh, that's funny, I did them in the wrong order. So the third one there, I just mentioned that already, the top SOC activities by volume or response activities. And then, that's funny. And then, I'm here to help. We're here to help. I do this every day, pretty much. I'm happy to, if you reach out to your TAM or your client manager or your RSD, happy to come on site and do this. It takes about a day, 4 to 5, 6 hours to get through a lot of this. We don't get a lot in terms of, we build an action plan at the end, and you build out a roadmap. If you were here for the NTT presentation earlier, you saw they're a very complex version with every single step detailed. When I do it, it's a quick, high-level plan. It's pointing you in the right direction to make sure you're not running off the railroad. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, great.
Or at least one to get us going. Maybe a very simple question. We have installed Exabeam AA in our environment, but we don't have a data lake or we don't have a SIEM front-ending that.
Yep.
So we're just directly pumping the logs coming out of our devices.
Yep, pattern 1 up there, right?
Yep.
Yep.
And that's led to a lot of confusion and noise.
Okay.
So how do we best handle such scenario? Because we don't have data lake today. We don't have any SIEM in-house today.
Yep.
What is the best way to utilize AA under those circumstances?
For sure. That's a great question. And I think the issue is what starts work, right? I asked that question. So it sounds to me like y'all haven't decided what starts the work. Is it a notable out of AA? Is it an email from AA to something else? Is it 8 other systems that generate emails? I mean, my recommendation to you is pick something that starts the work for everybody. AA can be that tool. If you want it to be email, let it be email, and AA forwards to email. But you are going to have to pivot out of email back into the tool to actually do the investigation. But it will be 1 step instead of 13 steps. I'm exaggerating. It's not really 13, but not a click, 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 click. It's click, click, investigate, first decision. Instead of, do I go here sometimes or here there sometimes? That causes confusion, and that slows things down. Right? One of my goals in these is I want to get a SOC team. Here, let me ask this question, and you don't have to answer since you asked the question. How many of you would say your average SOC team to do an initial triage investigation is over an hour? Right, right. Most people, how many would you say it's over 45 minutes? Raise your hand. Over 30 minutes. I should do it around 30 minutes. I'm asking the question wrong. Around 30 minutes. A couple people raised. Around 15 minutes. Some of you are asleep. Or I didn't go high enough. Maybe that's the issue. I didn't say it takes 3 or 4 hours. It's longer than you think if you're honest, or you sit down with the SOC analyst. They don't really get to the point where they're doing a real investigation. They're opening the case or the email or whatever, and they look at it and they're like, I have no clue. Done, next one. And that's the whole point. We're missing everything. You're doing all these detections and alerts, and they're not having time, or they don't have the context to investigate it, so they move on. They essentially ignore it. So why did you pay for that great security tool if you're going to ignore half the alerts? Or you're going to look at them and go, I don't have time for that. It's too complicated. Next one. Right? You've got to figure out a way to map all that out together. The automation in advanced analytics can do that if you configure it correctly with the timeline. So I can look at the timeline. Any analyst can see the same timeline and get to a very similar decision. Instead of having, I don't know, maybe today, maybe that alert, this analyst needs to go and just looks at querying my SIEM. Or this one says, I don't think that's important today. We're going to ignore that one. Part of it's around getting consistency at your lower tiers. That also helps speed up your investigations. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to cover.